The debate between art style versus graphics has been one that's been part of gaming for many generations, and depending on what kind of games you enjoy, you may staunchly prefer one over the other. In my case, my favorite games are usually JRPGs, fighting games, and action-adventure games, so because of my preferences, I don't have much affinity towards graphics. But the reason as to why I'm making this video is not just to argue my preference, but to also share my observations of things I've seen transpire recently in gaming, which often revolves around the trend of developers implementing realistic graphics in their games. And unfortunately, by observing the status of some of the games released this year, I can see how this trend can become harmful to the gaming industry. For example, with the release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Square Enix came out and stated that the game performed below their expectations, which is a strange statement to hear because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was received well critically and sold millions of copies. But despite all this perceived success, the game still underperformed? However, if you've been following Square Enix for the past decade, you'd notice that they've been echoing similar sentiments ever since Tomb Raider 2013, and notably towards last year's Final Fantasy XVI. But in 2024, I found that Square Enix is not the only publisher/developer that has this perspective, as other games with sophisticated graphics have underperformed as well, like Hellblade 2, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and Star Wars Outlaws. However, contrary to the somber outcomes, games with less sophisticated graphics have been doing extremely well, like Persona 3 Reload, Unicorn Overlord, Astrobot, Sonic X Shadow Generations, Metaphor ReFantazio, and Stellar Blade. So, with this contrast of games with high graphical fidelity underperforming and games with lower graphical fidelity finding great success, it makes me wonder if chasing graphical realism in games today worth the effort. So, before I get further into this video, I want to ask you, the audience, one question. When it comes to a game, how do you rank these three components, from most important to least important? Story, gameplay, and graphics. Now for me, because I love JRPGs and action-adventure games, my ranking goes story number 1 as most important, gameplay number 2, and graphics last. And depending on your own preferences in games, your ranking may look similar to mine or very different. Now let's take this concept and apply it to game development. See, because of financial and timely restrictions, a lot of developers aren't afforded the luxury to push their game in story, gameplay, and graphics. And due to these restrictions, developers have to make compromises. Let's take Alice for example. This year they released Persona 3 Reload, Unicorn Overlord, and Metaphor ReFantazio. All three are great games that achieved great success. However, in terms of graphics, none of them are outstanding. Even Alice's biggest game this year, Metaphor, got scrutinized because of its low graphical fidelity. But despite this, it scored a 94 on Metacritic and sold 1 million copies its first day of release. So, with Atlus's three games, we can see examples of developers choosing to prioritize story and gameplay over graphical fidelity, and still finding success in doing so. This is because they understand what truly captivates their audience, and what immerses them in their game is fundamentally an epic story and fun gameplay. However, in contrast, if you look at another game released this year, Hellblade 2, this game is one that exemplifies the studio putting all their eggs into one basket, that basket being visual fidelity. See, Hellblade 2 was praised for its beautiful visuals and graphical realism. But despite all these praises, Hellblade 2 was criticized for being a pretty walking simulator with puzzles. And even though it's difficult to find out Hellblade 2 sales due to it being on Game Pass and digital only, there are still reports that the game has underperformed. But despite this, the fact that the game's sales are this ambiguous is not a good sign, because if it was successful, Microsoft wouldn't be so hesitant in reporting its success. And even though Hellblade 2 scored well on Metacritic, it didn't score as well as any of the aforementioned Atlus games. Therefore, by looking at Atlus's success this year and comparing it to Ninja Theory's struggles with Hellblade 2, it just shows that just because a game has high graphical fidelity doesn't mean it's a good game. And instead of wasting resources to achieve realism, Atlus shows that what's truly essential in delivering a good game is good gameplay, a good story, and good art direction. Now, another game that faced similar issues to Hellblade 2 was Suicide Squad. See, despite its realistic character models, open world, and big budget, the game bombed terribly. And on top of this tremendous failure, one common viewpoint regarding Suicide Squad is that Arkham Knight, a game released 9 years prior, looked better. Now, when it comes to graphical fidelity, of course Suicide Squad has more going on. With the more advanced motion capturing and modeling software, Suicide Squad looks more realistic than Arkham Knight. But if we're talking about aesthetics and visual appeal, I personally find Arkham Knight to be the better looking game because of its art direction. See, when I look at Suicide Squad's gameplay, I feel nothing. It just looks like any modern generic third-person shooter with DC cosmetics. But when I look at Arkham Knight's gameplay, I feel like I'm watching Batman. Whether it be the dark tones, muddy colors, murky police stations, dreary skies, garbage, anarchy, or the city being drenched in a constant pouring of depressing rain, Gotham City feels like a real, disheveled, and grimy place. And these artistic decisions to make Gotham look the way it looks is what gives Arkham Knight and the Arkham games their own identity. See, when I look at Arkham Knight, I can easily tell what it is. But when I look at Suicide Squad, sure I know what it is, but it looks too similar to other popular games out there like Apex Legends, Fortnite, or something Ubisoft would make. So my point is, where Arkham Knight shines is that with its artistic direction, it carved out a lane of its own to manifest its own unique artistic version of Batman. And where Suicide Squad falters is that, instead of standing out, it tries to emulate other trends, thereby weakening its own artistic identity. But let's go back to Atlus. Another game of theirs that has an exceptional art direction is Persona 5. See, Persona 5 is considered by many as one of the best JRPGs last generation, which is crazy if you think about it because that means many consider Persona 5 to be on the same level or better than Dragon Quest XI, Final Fantasy XV, and Final Fantasy VII Remake, which all had bigger budgets. But what really drew people to Persona 5 is how the game made them feel as they were playing it. Whether it be the cozy atmosphere at Café Leblanc, the otherworldliness of mementos, or the memorable palaces with distinct themes. All these locales helped in making Persona 5 a memorable experience for players. And it's all because Atlus's attention to detail was not based on graphical realism, but rather on the music and art direction of the game. Now, another JRPG that was released around the same time was Final Fantasy XV. See, by comparison, this game looks more realistic and has more detailed and expansive environments than Persona 5. However, despite the graphical differences, Final Fantasy XV looks more bland and mundane than Persona 5, and that's because one game focused on how realistic they can make their game look, and the other game focused on how interesting they can make their game look. But the reason as to why I'm comparing these two games is because both games had the same objective, to be a JRPG. Both of the objectives were to immerse the player into their world and make the player feel invested in the main cast journey. And in my opinion, despite Persona 5's visual limitations, I feel like it executed in that objective better than Final Fantasy XV. All this to say, developers don't need a budget that costs hundreds of millions of dollars just to make the games look realistic. Instead, if a developer focused more on crafting a unique creative vision, they'll see that they could gain the same amount of notoriety and success with a much lower budget. So, by comparing Persona 5 to Final Fantasy 15, we can see that what's more important than graphical fidelity is great art design. Now, I couldn't make this video without mentioning Nintendo, who are the kings when it comes to doing a whole lot with less. And despite the console's limited hardware, they're still able to produce generational games. Now, the go-to example for why graphics don't matter in most video essays is The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. But even though this example is overused, I think it's probably the best example out there. See, before Wind Waker was announced, Nintendo released a demo that showcased Link fighting Ganondorf, and in this demo, the art style looked dark and realistic. So, for good reason, many fans thought that this demo was a teaser for the next Zelda game, but to their surprise, the installment of Zelda they were anticipating was instead the cartoon-looking Wind Waker. Now, even though Wind Waker's art style is widely appreciated now, back then, that wasn't the sentiment. I mean, Wind Waker's art style got so much backlash that Twilight Princess was made as a response. But fast forward a few generations, and people love Zelda's cel-shaded art direction as it has been adopted in other Zelda games like Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. But looking back at the 6th and 7th generation of gaming, there are a lot of lower budget games with unique art styles that also aged well. Staying with Nintendo, the Mario Galaxy games are exemplary of games that are built on limited hardware, but because of their great art direction and level designs, they're virtually timeless. And the same goes for Japan Studios and Team Ico's games like Shadow of the Colossus, Ico, Gravity Rush, and The Last Guardian. I mean, Journey, Ni no Kuni, Okami, Asura's Wrath, Jet Set Radio, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. I could go on, but you get the point. Back then, developers couldn't rely on making their game look as realistic as possible because they didn't have the hardware to do so. So back then, it was imperative that for a game to be received well, it had to have a great art direction. And fast forward to now, there are still plenty of examples of games that follow this method and are very successful, despite the common trend of publishers dumping millions of dollars to make their games look realistic. So, objectively, my whole argument for this video is pretty much null and void, because big publishers like Square Enix, Take-Two, Sony, and others will continue to make games that use an enormous amount of their budget to make their games look as realistic as possible. But to be frank, I don't want to come across like I'm complaining about realism in games. I mean, this year, Tekken 8, Black Myth Wukong, Warhammer 40k, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth were all examples of games that had both realism and great art direction. But for every successful game like those aforementioned, there are those that turn out to be disastrous, like Suicide Squad, Hellblade 2, and Star Wars Outlaws. And I'm willing to bet that if any of these 3 games focused more on art direction, story, and gameplay, instead of detailed graphics, they would have found better success. And that, in essence, is my whole point. This trend of pursuing realistic graphics in games is unsustainable, as it inflates developers' budgets to hundreds of millions of dollars, when realistically, there should be only a few tens of millions. But let's end this video off with another example from Atlus. See, after Atlus found huge success with Persona 5, they released 3 games after, those games being 13 Sentinels, Shin Megami Tensei 5, and Soul Hackers 2. Now 13 Sentinels and SMT5 did well enough to serve their niche audiences and gain a decent profit, but did not achieve the same mainstream success as Persona 5. And unfortunately, Soul Hackers 2 was a complete flop. But my point in explaining all this is to demonstrate how after Persona 5, Atlus went through numerous years without a huge hit. But despite this cold streak, Atlus was able to keep themselves afloat off the success of Persona 5, Persona 5 Royal, and the other Persona 5 spin-offs. And because of this, in 2024, Atlus was able to make a huge comeback with hits back to back to back with Persona 3 Reload, Unicorn Overlord, and metaphor. But some developers can't do this because when their budget is so inflated and they fail, they suffer mass layoffs and become risk adverse. And this is exactly what happened to WB Games after Suicide Squad failed. They laid off a bunch of their staff and made a statement saying that from now on, they were going to focus on Batman, Mortal Kombat, Harry Potter, and Game of Thrones. So basically, the few franchises they have that are too big and popular to fail. Now I know there are some nuances to this, and some developers can get away with more than others due to different situations and publishing deals, but in general, this is an issue. Yes, some developers can place huge bets on a singular game, try to make it as detailed as possible, and reach huge success. But there are also many who try the same and fail terribly. And if only they had opened their eyes and realized that investing an absurd amount of money just to achieve realistic graphics isn't necessary, they could have circumvented their failure if they had just focused on art direction instead.